Hello, I'm Steph, and in this video I'm going to talk about what you need for your new roborovski. I just made a video on roborovskis in the wild, so a lot of this information is taken from learning about roborovskis in their natural environment and how we can safely replicate this in an enclosure as much as possible. Okay, so here we go. The first thing you will need is the right environment for your robo's enclosure, also space for an enclosure and the enclosure itself. The recommended minimum size for a hamster enclosure is 100 centimeters by 50 centimeters by 50 centimeters. This gives 5,000 centimeters squared of floor space, so you can get an idea of size. The enclosure I have is 150 by 50 by 50 centimeters, which is 7,500 centimeters squared. The enclosure I have is also formaldehyde free, so it's non-toxic. The enclosure will need to be well ventilated but also secure and safe. It will need a lid to prevent items dropping into the enclosure and to keep it as dust free as possible. Also to stop your robo from escaping. So because the enclosure needs to be so large so as to offer proper care and to be able to fit in it everything that needs to fit in an enclosure, you will need somewhere safe and suitable to house it. There's a misconception that hamsters don't take up very much space, and actually they need quite a lot of floor space. So find somewhere where there isn't too much noise or disturbance, somewhere without too much dust, so not a laundry room for example, and somewhere that other pets cannot bother it. Also, you want somewhere that doesn't get extreme temperatures, so somewhere that isn't going to get too hot or too cold, and of course indoors, not outdoors. You also want to find somewhere where it can be dark for the full length of the night and obviously light in day, so that the hamster can have that natural cycle of daytime and nighttime. Pet shops don't always sell enclosures which meet the minimum size requirements, and many times people buy an enclosure with a roborovski and then realise they can't fit everything they need in the enclosure and that the robo doesn't have enough space, and then have to find another enclosure. So this is just a heads up really. Some of the enclosures come with a wheel which doesn't always work very well, and I think that this can be quite cruel because roborovskis have so much energy and a wheel really is a must. So just be aware of that the wheel is big enough and that it will spin readily for your roborovski. The other thing to think about is the depth of the enclosure. So for example, Pets at Home sell an enclosure that just meets the minimum size requirements, but this doesn't have enough depth or a good amount of depth in the bedding for burrowing, and this is because there are bars, which means the bedding would obviously fall out. Speaking of bedding, this is another thing that you will need, and lots of it. All hamsters, roborovskis included, are burrowers, and in the wild, roborovskis would look to create burrows where there is at least 1 meter in depth in the sand. So whilst we can't necessarily provide that for our roborovskis, I would suggest having the bedding as deep as possible and at least 30 centimeters in depth. I wouldn't recommend bedding like aspen shavings because even though this is recommended as safe bedding, I actually find that it's very sharp, and I did cut my finger on it just kind of crumpling it up to put it into the enclosure. And so my thinking is that if my robo is burrowing in this bedding, it could quite easily cause it quite an injury. I use soft bedding such as Katie Clean & Cozy and Carefresh Natural. Other beddings to avoid include sawdust, anything dusty, fluffy bedding as this is highly dangerous, materials like fleece for example. Also, wood shaving bedding can be very dangerous because not only are they sharp, but some of them contain oils from the wood which can be toxic to hamsters like pine and cedar. As I said, sand is really important. Roborovskis originate from the desert, and therefore you want to provide your robo lots of sand and soil-like substrate. This will allow your robo to display natural behaviours like digging in the sand, burying food, rolling in the sand to clean themselves. Dig boxes are good for hamsters, but with a roborovski I would suggest that more of the enclosure should be sand than just a dig box. So only get a dig box if you wanted to put a different type of substrate in it for enrichment. When buying sand, just check that it's not classed as dust, like chinchilla dust for example. I use Reptisand, which has no colorants, dyes or added chemicals. And with a lot of sand, it's useful to have a sand sifter. A multi-chamber hide, this helps to mimic the burrow structures that they would have in the wild, just a little bit, not fully, but hamsters generally seem to really like these multi-chamber hides, and in my roborovski certainly does. I wouldn't say that this is a compulsory item to get if you're providing enough bedding for your hamster to burrow. but it's quite a nice option, so I thought I'd include it. A water bowl is obviously a necessary item. It isn't natural for roborovskis to drink from bottles, and this can restrict the amount of water that they drink. There can also be issues with water dripping and bacteria building up. So I would recommend creating a small pool or simply using a bowl like this one. This bowl is a heavy glass bowl so that my Robbo can't tip it over, and it's the perfect size. You might wonder if you need a food bowl as well, but no, it's better to scatter feed because it's more natural for your hamster to forage for food rather than it all being in one place in a bowl. I will talk a bit more about food in a minute. Platforms and stilts are important when you are using deep bedding. Anything that goes on top of the bedding will need to be supported so that nothing can collapse onto your roborovski if he or she burrows underneath it. As such, it's a good idea to have a couple of platforms which are on stilts, food, sprays, herbs and flowers. Obviously, you will need food for your Robbo. Be careful when buying any old hamster food from a pet shop, as they are often cheaply made and don't contain the correct balanced diet for your roborovski, despite what they may say on the packet. Roborovskis can eat a huge range of food. They are omnivores, which means they eat plants and insects. According to research, wild roborovskis eat mainly plant seeds, with 70 to 90% of their diet consisting of plant seeds. And in the wild, they also eat plant leaves and stems. On shops like Etsy, you can get hold of some really great hamster food mixes, and you can provide them with small amounts of fresh leaves such as spinach or broccoli or something like that. You can also add sprays to their enclosure, such as millet spray for example, and you can add herbs and flowers. A wheel is very important for your Robbo, as they are extremely energetic and fast creatures, which in the wild would run around the desert at night foraging. Roborovskis love a wheel, and they will spend a huge amount of their time awake on the wheel. And so getting the right wheel is very important, as is where you put it in the enclosure. The wheel needs to be nice and big, because the larger the wheel, the more control your roborovski will have over the speed of the wheels. Small wheels are often sold in pet shops or with enclosures, and they will either not work very well or they will be too small and fast, and roborovskis spend a lot of time in these wheels flipping over the top or falling out repeatedly, neither of which are safe or okay for your roborovski. And also, not to point out the obvious, but roborovskis don't run in wheels in the wild, so flipping out of a wheel or flipping over and over and over in a wheel is not in the slightest natural to them, and is therefore going to be distressing, and as I said, they can potentially get very hurt from this. They will continue to return to the wheel even if this is the case, because they have that much energy and it's natural for them to run so much. So rather than put them in a really horrible situation like that, the best thing to do is get a larger wheel so that they have more control over it. The wheel should never have any gaps in it, like mesh or bars, as this can cause severe injury to your roborovski's feet, especially if they get caught in it. The wheel should not require your roborovski to bend its back in any way whilst running, and again, in the wild, they would just be running along the desert. They wouldn't be bending their back whilst running. So the best size wheel for a Robbo should have a diameter of at least 20 centimetres. The one that I have is 25.9 centimetres, which is the medium Night Angel wheel. And I really rate this because some of the larger wheels are a little bit too heavy for a roborovski to build up momentum on, and I've found some of the other larger wheels are a little bit stiffer than this wheel. When getting a bigger wheel, you need to make sure that your Robbo can grip the wheel in order to turn it without too much effort, which will either strain its legs or make it think it can't run on the wheel and stop trying to use it. Robbos will often urinate whilst running on the wheel, which means you need to clean the wheel frequently. Urine soaks into the cork, which makes it harder to clean, although you can wipe it with a damp cloth and allow it to dry throughout the day, and you can replace the cork liners too, which is good. Tunnels. Robbos are prey animals and they like to be able to hide and to burrow. Tunnels are a great way to allow your roborovski to move around his or her enclosure feeling safe, but you don't want to use extensive plastic tunnel networks which slot together. The best types of tunnels are ceramic, willow, cork, wood, terracotta, anything natural and free from chemicals or free from anything that would harm your Robbo should they chew on it, such as plastic for example. You can also put the tunnel half into the bedding to help encourage them to burrow. And you can buy peeping tunnels like this one, which you can put below the bedding, and it gives you a little bit of an insight to what it looks like when your robot goes down into the bedding. Hides. For the same reason as tunnels, hides are a great way to give your robot plenty to explore and to hide in. You can also get some really aesthetic hides which can contribute to a themed enclosure if this is what you're going for. Branches are another natural feature you can include, such as sand-blasted grapevine, like this one for example. So these all allow their natural behaviour, which in the wild would involve using plants, rocks and anything else available as shelter from predators, a way to move around unseen in the moonlit desert. Other substrates as well as sand, these include soil such as cocoa soil, beach chips, moss and rocks, so for example natural sandstone rocks of different sizes. You will also need a pet carrier or box that you can put your roborovski in when cleaning them out or travelling to a vet. You might also need nail clippers, but obviously only clip their nails if you know what you're doing, otherwise an exotic vet can do this for you. And another item that you might find useful is a mini dustpan to help clean out their enclosure. I hope you found this useful in preparing for your robo. Thanks so much for watching, and please don't forget to like and subscribe.